The children were traveling under the care of Aunt Enid, who always had far more of these tiresome odds and ends than Mother had, and it was at the last moment, when the cab was almost to be expected to be there, that Aunt Enid rushed out to the corner shop and returned with 4 new spades, 4 new pails, and 4 new shrimping nets, and presented them to the children just in time for them to be added to the heap of odds and ends with which the cab was filled up. "I hope it's not ungrateful," said Mavis at the station as they stood waiting by the luggage mound while Aunt Enid went to take the tickets. "But why couldn't she have bought them at Beachfield? Makes us look such babies," said Frances, who would not be above using a wooden spade at the proper time and place, but did not care to be branded in the face of all Waterloo Junction as one of those kids off to the seaside with little spades and pails. Kathleen and Bernard were, however, young enough to derive a certain pleasure from stroking the smooth, curved surface of the spades till Aunt Enid came fussing back with the tickets and told them to put their gloves on for goodness sake and try not to look like street children. I am sorry that the first thing you should hear about the children should be that they did not care about their Aunt Enid. But this was unfortunately the case. And if you think this was not nice of them, I can only remind you that you do not know their Aunt Enid. There was a short, sharp struggle with the porter, a flustered passage along the platform, and the children were safe in the carriage marked, "Reserved," thrown into it, as it were, with all that small fry of luggage which I have just described. Then Aunt Enid fussed off again to exchange a few last home truths with the porter, and the children were left. "We breathe again," said Mavis. "Not yet, we don't," said Frances. "There'll be some more fuss as soon as she comes back. I'd almost as soon not go to the sea as go with her." "But you've never seen the sea," Mavis reminded him. "I know," said Frances, morosely. "But look at all this." He indicated the tangle of their possessions which littered seats and rack. "I do wish—" He stopped, for a head appeared in the open doorway, in a round hat very like Aunt Enid's. But it was not Aunt Enid's. The face under the hat was a much younger, kinder one. "I'm afraid this carriage is reserved," said the voice that belonged to the face. "Yes," said Kathleen, "but there's lots of room if you like to come too." "I don't know if the aunt we're with would like it," said the more cautious Mavis. "We should, of course," she added to meet the kind smiling eyes that looked from under the hat that was like Aunt Enid's. The lady said, "I'm an aunt too. I'm going to meet my nephew at the junction. The train's frightfully crowded. If I were to talk to your aunt, perhaps on the strength of our common aunthood. The train will start in a minute. I haven't any luggage to be a bother. Nothing but one paper." She had indeed a folded newspaper in her hands. "Oh, do get in," said Kathleen, dancing with anxiety. "I'm sure Aunt Enid won't mind." Kathleen was always hopeful. Suppose the train were to start or anything. "Well, if you think I may," said the lady, and tossed her paper into the corner in a light-hearted way which the children found charming. Her pleasant face was rising in the oblong of the carriage doorway. Her foot was on the carriage step, when suddenly she retreated back and down. It was almost as though someone pulled her off the carriage step. "Excuse me," said a voice. "This carriage is reserved." The pleasant face of the lady disappeared, and the face of Aunt Enid took its place. The lady vanished. Aunt Enid trod on Kathleen's foot, pushed against Bernard's waistcoat, sat down, partly on Mavis and partly on Frances, and said, "Of all the impertinence." Then someone banged the door. The train shivered and trembled and pulled itself together in the way we all know so well, grunted, snorted, screamed, and was off. Aunt Enid stood up arranging things on the rack, so that the children could not even see if the nice lady had found a seat in the train. "I say," said Bernard, "I do hope it's a seal. I've never seen a seal." "I hope they do catch it," said Kathleen. "Fancy seeing a real live mermaid." "If it's a real live mermaid, I jolly well hope they don't catch her," said Frances. "So do I," said Mavis. "I'm certain she would die in captivity." "But I'll tell you what," said Frances. "We'll go and look for her, first thing tomorrow. I suppose," he added thoughtfully, "Sabrina was a sort of mermaid. She hasn't a tail, you know," Kathleen reminded him. "It isn't the tail that makes the mermaid," Frances reminded her. "It's being able to live underwater. If it was the tail, then mackerels would be mermaids. And, of course, they're not." "I see," said Kathleen. "I wish," said Bernard, "that she'd given us bows and arrows instead of pails and spades. And then we could have gone seal shooting, or mermaid shooting," said Kathleen. "Yes, that would have been ripping." Before Frances and Mavis could say how shocked they were at the idea of shooting mermaids, Aunt Enid woke up and took the newspaper away from them, because newspapers are not fit reading for children. She was somehow the kind of person before whom you never talk about anything that you really care for, and it was impossible therefore to pursue either seals or mermaids. It seemed best to read Eric and the rest of the books. It was uphill work. But the last two remarks of Bernard and Kathleen had sunk into the minds of the two elder children. That was why, when they had reached Beachfield and found Mother and rejoiced over her, and when Aunt Enid had unexpectedly gone on by that same train to stay with her really relations at Bournemouth, they did not say any more to the little ones about mermaids or seals, but just joined freely in the chorus of pleasure at Aunt Enid's departure. "I thought she was going to stay with us all the time," said Kathleen. "Oh, Mummy, I am so glad she isn't." Mavis woke Frances up very early indeed, and they got out and dressed quite quietly, not washing, I'm sorry to say, because water makes such as when you pour the I'm afraid the hair was not very thoroughly brushed either. There was not sulphur in the road and the wool, unless you count the mill cat who had been out all night and was creeping home very tired and dull looking, and a yellow hammer who sat at 300 yards on the road and repeated his name over and over again in that This desire to find the mermaid must have been wonderfully strong in Francis, for it completely swallowed the longing of years, the longing to see the sea. It had been too dark the night before to see anything but the winking faces of the houses as the fly went past them. But now, as he and Mavis ran noiselessly down the sandy path in their rubber shoes and turned the corner of the road, he saw a great pale gray something spread out in front of him, lit with points of red and gold fire where the sun touched it. He stopped. "Mavis," he said, in quite an odd voice. "That's the sea." "Yes," she said and stopped too. "It isn't a bit what I expected," he said, and went on running. "Don't you like it?" asked Mavis, running after him. "Oh, like," said Francis. "It isn't the sort of thing you like." When they got down to the shore, the sands and the pebbles were all wet because the tide had just gone down, and there were the rocks and the little rock pools, and the limpets, and whelks, and the little yellow periwinkles looking like particularly fine Indian corn all scattered among the red and the brown and the green seaweed. "Now, this is jolly," said Francis. "This is jolly if you like. I almost wish we'd wakened the others. It doesn't seem quite fair." "Oh, they've seen it before," Mavis said, quite truly, "and I don't think it's any good going by force to look for mermaids. Do you?" "Besides," said Francis, saying what had been in their thoughts since yesterday in the train, Kathleen wanted to shoot mermaids, and Bernard thought it was seals, anyhow. They had sat down and were hastily pulling off their shoes and stockings. "Of course," said he, "we shan't find anything. It isn't likely." "Well," she said, "for anything we jolly well know, they may have found her already. Take care how you go over these rocks. They're awfully slippy." "As if I didn't know that," said he, and ran across the narrow strip of sand that divided rocks from shingle and set his foot for the first time in the sea. It was only a shallow little green and white rock pool, but it was the sea all the same. "I say, isn't it cold?" said Mavis, withdrawing pink and dripping toes. "Do mind how you go." "As if I," said Francis, again, and sat down suddenly and splashingly in a large, clear sparkling pool. "Now, I suppose we've got to go home at once and you change," said Mavis, not without bitterness. "Nonsense," said Francis, getting up with some difficulty and clinging wetly to Mavis to steady himself. "I'm quite dry, almost." "You know what colds are like," said Mavis, "and staying indoors all day, or perhaps bed, and mustard plasters and gruel with butter in it. Oh, come along home. We should never have found the mermaid. It's much too bright and light and everyday-ish for anything like magic to happen. Come on home, do. Let's just go out to the end of the rocks," Francis urged, "just to see what it's like where the water gets deep and the seaweed goes swish, swish, all long and lanky and grassy, like in the Sabrina picture." "Halfway then, not more," said Mavis, firmly. "It's dangerous. Deep outside. Mother said so." And halfway they went, Mavis still cautious, and Francis, after his wedding, almost showing off in his fine carelessness of whether he went in again or not. It was very jolly. You know how soft and squeezy the blobby kind of seaweed is to walk on, and how satin smooth is the ribbon kind. How sharp are limpets, especially when they are covered with barnacles, and how comparatively bearable to the foot are the pale primrose-colored hemispheres of the periwinkle. "Now," said Mavis, "come on back. We'll run all the way as soon as we get our shoes and stockings on for fear of colds." "I almost wish we hadn't come," said Francis, turning with a face of gloom. "You didn't really think we should find a mermaid, did you?" Mavis asked, and laughed, though she was really annoyed with Francis for getting wet and cutting short this exciting morning game. But she was a good sister. "It's all been so silly. Flopping into that pool, and talking and rotting, and just walking out and in again. We ought to have come by moonlight, and been very quiet and serious, and said, 'Sabrina fair, listen where thou art sitting. Ow! Hold on a minute. I've caught my foot in something.'" Mavis stopped and took hold of her brother's arm to steady him, and as she did so, both children plainly heard a voice that was not the voice of either of them. It was the sweetest voice in the world, they thought, and it said, "Save her. We die in captivity." Francis looked down and had a sort of sudden sight of something white and brown and green that moved and went quickly down under the stone on which Mavis was standing. There was nothing now holding his foot. "I say," he said, on a deep breath of awe and wonder, "did you hear that?" "Of course, I heard it. We couldn't both have fancied it," he said. "I wish it had told us who to save, and where, and how. Whose do you think that voice was?" Mavis asked softly. "The mermaid's," said Francis. "Who else's could it have been?" "Then the magic's really begun. Mermaids aren't magic," he said, "any more than flying fishes or giraffes are. But she came when you said, 'Sabrina fair, said Mavis. Sabrina wasn't a mermaid, said Frances firmly. It's no use trying to join things on when they won't. Come on. We may as well be getting home. Mightn't she be? Suggested Mavis. A mermaid? I mean, like salmon that live in rivers and go down to the sea. I say, I never thought of that. How simply ripping if it turned out to be really Sabrina. Wouldn't it be? But which do you suppose could be her? The one who spoke to us, or the one she's afraid will die in captivity? The one she wants us to save. They had reached the shore by now, and Mavis looked up from turning her brown stockings right way out to say, I suppose we didn't really both fancy it. Could we have? Isn't there some sort of scientific magic that makes people think the same things as each other when it's not true at all? Like with Indian mango tricks? Uncle Fred said so. You know, they call it something. I'll tell you something, said Frances, urgent with shoelace. If we keep on saying things weren't when we know perfectly well they were, we shall soon dish up any sort of chance of magic we may ever have had. When do you find people in books going on like that? They just say, this is magic, and behave as if it was. They don't go pretending they're not sure. Why, no magic would stand it. Aunt Dorothea once told me that all magic was like Prince Rupert's drop. Mavis owned. If once you broke it, there was nothing left but a little dust. That's just what I'm saying, isn't it? We've always felt there was magic right enough, haven't we? Well, now we've come across it. Don't let's be silly and pretend. Let's believe in it as hard as ever we can. Mavis, shall we, eh? Believing in things makes them stronger. Aunt Dorothea said that too. You remember. They stood up in their shoes. Shall we tell the others? Mavis asked. We must, said Frances. It would be so sneakish not to. But they won't believe us. We shall have to be like Cassandra and not mind. I only wish I knew who it is we've got to save, said Mavis. Frances had a very strong and perfect feeling that they would know this all in good time. He could not have explained this, but he felt it. All he said was, let's run. And they ran. Kathleen and Bernard met them at the gate, dancing with excitement and impatience. Where have you been? They cried, and what on earth? And why, you're all wet, France. Down to the sea. Shut up, I know I am. Their elder brother came in and passed up the path to the gate. You might have called us, said Kathleen in a more in sorrow than in anger sort of voice. But anyhow, you've lost something by going out so early without us. Lost something? What? Hearing the great news? Said Bernard. And he added, aha. What news? Wouldn't you like to know? Bernard was naturally annoyed at having been left out of the first expedition of the holidays. Anyone would have, even you or I. Out with it, said Francis, with a hand on Bernard's ear. There came a yell from Bernard and Mother's voice from the window, saying, "Children, children. All right, Mummy. Now, Bear, don't be a young rotter. What's the news?" "You're hurting my ear," was all Bernard's rejoinder. "All right," said Francis. "We've got some news too. But we won't tell, will we, Mavis?" "Oh, don't," said Kathleen. "Don't let's be sneaky. The very first day too. It's only that they've caught the mermaid, and I'm afraid she'll die in captivity, like you said." "What's yours?" Francis had released Bernard's ear and now he turned to Mavis. "So that's it," he said slowly. "Who's got her?" "The circus people." "What's your news?" asked Kathleen eagerly. "After Breck," said Francis. "Yes, Mother. Half a sec. I apologize about the ear, Bernard. We will tell you all. Oh, it's quite different from what you think. We meet and discuss the situation in the mill the minute we're free from Breck. Agreed?" "Right. Yes, Mother. Coming." "Then there must," Mavis whispered to Francis, "be two mermaids. They can't both be Sabrina." "Then which?" "We've got to save one of them anyhow," Francis answered with the light of big adventure in his eye. "They die in captivity."